My name is Lisa Flores, and I am a faculty in the Department of Communication and the Ethnic Studies program here at the University of Utah. And we have accompaniment yet again. Regardless, it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, president of Spelman College, the nation's oldest and perhaps foremost historically black college for women. Also author of the highly acclaimed and provocative book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race. As you can no doubt imagine, Dr. Tatum has a distinguished career as an academic, an administrator, a clinical psychologist, and even a race activist. In 2002, she was appointed the 9th president of Spelman College. Prior to that, Dr. Tatum spent 13 years at Mount Holyoke College. While there, she served as professor of psychology, as department chair, dean of the college, and as acting president. She has also held appointments at Westfield State College and the University of California, Santa Barbara. A clinical psychologist by training and in practice, Dr. Tatum received her Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Wesleyan University and her MA and PhD in clinical psychology, both from the University of Michigan. In addition, just recently in 2000, Dr. Tatum received a Master of Arts in Religious Studies from Hartford Seminary. Her career, as you no doubt imagine, is rife with recognition of her impact. I won't spend all of the time introducing her, going over the details of that, but I want to give just a few notable moments in her recent history. In 1998, she received the Book of the Year Award by the National Association of Multicultural Education. In 2003, she was named Public Sector of the Year by the Financial Women's Association. She is the author of another highly recognized and widely read book, Assimilation Blues, Black Families in White Communities, Who Succeeds and Why. She is a regular feature in national discussions on race, with presentations, for instance, on Oprah, NPR, CNN's Talk Back Live, Fox's The O'Reilly Factor, and the Learning Channel's documentary called Understanding Race. She has been featured and/or she has provided commentary for the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Boston Globe, the Christian Science Monitor, and a number of regional and local newspapers. As you listen to her today, I think you'll understand why she has become such a crucial part of our nation's discussion, our nation's thinking, and indeed even our nation's acting on race. I suspect you'll understand why I identify Dr. Tatum as a race activist. For what Dr. Tatum brings to the conversation on race, among many, many other things, is a consistent and a persistent call for reflection, understanding, and ultimately for action. Dr. Tatum argues forcefully across much of her work for our recognition, all of our recognition, of our daily individual, collective, and institutional participation in racism. She mandates that we understand racism as just one of the many isms, along with sexism, classism, heterosexism, anti-Semitism, and others, and that we model our lives to fight all of them at once. She argues that if we as a society are to build a just society, we must understand and respond to the wide range of isms. She both asks for and models a response. In her work, Dr. Tatum notes, for instance, that there is no neutral position on race or racism. There is no neutral moment in the fight for justice. If we as individuals, as members of communities, members of schools and other institutions, are not, at every moment of our lives, she argues, actively, deliberately working to end racism, then we're perpetrating racism. Moreover, she identifies how we, even as individuals working alone, can and should make change. By constantly building and extending what she calls our sphere of influence, or the places in our own lives where we can make change, we practice anti-racism. And in Dr. Tatum's life, she follows her words. She describes, for instance, her motivation to move into administration, and ultimately her motivation for accepting the position as presidency of Spelman College as motivated by that very sentiment of action to produce change. Here, as president, she has and has utilized the opportunity to dramatically and significantly make change and to be a factor in creating the world she and many of us envision. She is, I believe, an inspiration and should be a driving force in the ways in which we as members of the University of Utah community act to end racism. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I have to say, it's one of the nicest ones I've had in a long time, and I very much appreciate that. And I am delighted to be here at the University of Utah, and thank you all for coming. I understand that not long ago, Angela Davis was here, just a few days ago. And I want to just share a Angela Davis moment with you, if I could. I first heard Angela Davis speak myself when I was a graduating college senior at Wesleyan University, which was in the fall of 1974, which is, just speaks to the longevity of Angela Davis. But at the time, she had just written her autobiography. And I had hair like Angela Davis did then, which was, this big afro, and I was a great fan of Angela Davis, and I heard her speak. And afterwards, I went up and I had my personal hardcover copy of her autobiography, and I asked her to sign it. And she did, and I told her I was about to graduate because I actually, even though it was the fall, I graduated a semester early, so I was leaving the college at the end of that semester. And I said, what can I do about the things that you've been talking about? And she said, you should work against racism. And it's an interesting thing to me because, of course, that is what I have done most of my life. But to be here shortly after she's been here is particularly meaningful to me. So I am thankful for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. I want to talk a little bit about history. But before I do that, I want to begin by asking you to imagine a scene with me. The scene I want you to imagine is this. It's a common experience, I bet. Imagine that you are at home and the phone is ringing. Everyone is sitting around you and no one gets up to answer the phone. You say to yourself, why doesn't someone answer that phone? And you look around and everyone else is motionless, undisturbed. You think, well, maybe it's not really the phone, it's another room, maybe it's, the background TV sounds of a television program or something. But no, you keep hearing this ringing. And you start to wonder if it's maybe your imagination because nobody else seems to be paying any attention. But finally, you say, no, I definitely hear that phone, and if nobody else is going to get up to answer it, I guess I will. Raise your hand if you've had that experience. Okay. When I thought of this image, I laughed to myself and I said, I guess that's what they mean when they say, you've been called. Okay. Many of us have had an experience like that. Moments when we have been in situations and felt someone needs to respond to this. And not seeing anyone else stepping forward to do it, we've answered the call. The call that I've answered in my own life has been to teach about racism. I started teaching my course on the psychology of racism in 1980. And I was right out of graduate school. I was living in California. I was actually at the University of California, Santa Barbara, when I was asked to teach a class on the psychology. The class was called Group Exploration of Racism. And I was someone who was studying racial identity and racial socialization of black children who'd been raised in predominantly white communities. That was my dissertation topic. But I had not ever taught a course on group exploration of racism. But nobody else in the department wanted to do it. I was teaching part-time in the African American Studies department at UCSB. And so the chair of the department said, will you do it? And I said, well, sure. I guess I could. And I took it up. And I was 25 years old at the time and really didn't know what I was doing. Are there some graduate students in this room? I was not quite, I was ABD, as they say, all but dissertation. And I was a brand new instructor, and I took on this course. Somebody left behind some syllabi, and I put together this course, and I taught it. And at the end of the course, the students in my class, most of whom were white, it was racially mixed class, but UC Santa Barbara has a small population of color. Certainly at that time it was pretty small. And they filled out the evaluations and they said things like, "This course changed my life. Everyone at the university should take this class. Why did I have to wait till I was a senior or a junior in college to talk about these issues?" This was the kind of feedback I got. And as a 25-year-old, almost PhD, I was really taken with the impact that the course had in people's lives and thought, I ought to keep teaching this class. It was kind of like, the phone is ringing, maybe I should answer it. And I did continue to teach that class. But what I want to tell you in terms of history is not just about my personal history and the things that I learned from teaching about racism, and I hope we can have some conversation. I think we will have time for a little bit of Q&A, and so I hope we can have some dialogue about racism and what that means and why it's hard and all of that. But the history I want to talk to you about is about another 25-year-old, and that 25-year-old is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 25 years old when he was finishing his PhD in Boston, finishing a PhD in theology at Boston University, just married to Coretta Scott, now known as Coretta Scott King, who was a music student at New England Conservatory of Music. And the two of them, just married, were about to go to Montgomery, Alabama, because he had received a call, as they say, to be pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. That was the year 1954. Now, I was born in 1954, and I'm looking around this room, and I'm thinking that maybe I'm the only one who was alive in here in 1954. But raise your hand if you were alive in 1954. A few of you were there with me, okay? Well, let me just say, I like to describe myself sometimes as an integration baby. Being born in 1954, I was actually born in September of 1954, just 4 months after the famous Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. And because of that, I find it particularly interesting that I have written and talked about and taught about race most of my life. And I think it's not an accident that I was born in that's not a coincidence that race relations would be of interest to me given the time in which I was born. However, I was born in Tallahassee, Florida. And my parents were educators. My mom became a public school teacher, but my father was a professor at Florida A&M in Tallahassee, Florida at the time of my birth. And both my parents attended Howard University, and then my dad went on to the University of Iowa, which must have been quite an experience in the early 50s, and got his master's degree, his MFA in art, but then wanted to pursue a doctorate in art education. And he could have done that at Florida State University. They had a program in art education at Florida State, which is also in Tallahassee. But in 1954, even though it was after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the state of Florida, with all deliberate speed, had not yet desegregated the universities. And so what the state did to comply with the law was to pay the transportation of black graduate students to travel north to other schools. So my dad actually did his doctoral work at Pennsylvania State University, at Penn State, and the state of Florida paid his transportation, though as he made sure I understood, not his tuition. So in 1957, he completed his degree at Penn State, and in 1958, we moved to Massachusetts. Needless to say, he wasn't that interested in returning to Florida. So we moved to Massachusetts, where he became the first African-American professor at Bridgewater State College in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, which is the place where I grew up. So I feel a certain kinship with Dr. King, because in 1958, he had left Massachusetts, but in 1954, he was thinking about whether or not he wanted to return to the South. And Massachusetts is not perfect, and there's plenty of racism in Massachusetts. If you've ever seen, Eyes on the Prize, you know about the history of school desegregation in Boston. But it has a different form than it had during the Jim Crow South. And so as somebody who grew up in Massachusetts, it was a life relatively free of the social restrictions that characterized the South of my birth. And that is a life that Martin and Coretta experienced as graduate students in Boston. They could ride public transportation, attend concerts, cultural events, go to the movies, without having to worry about the for-colored signs, the whites only, for-colored only signs of Montgomery, Alabama. But nonetheless, in 1954, they decided to leave Boston and go to Montgomery to lead this church. They went because they were responding to a call. The phone was ringing, and they went, and they felt a sense of commitment and purpose. But responding to a call, whether it's teaching about racism or moving to Montgomery in 1954, answering that phone requires a certain level of courage. We can only imagine how much courage was required for Mr., in this case, Dr. and Mrs. King. Imagine this. Now you're 26 years old. Just a year after arriving in Montgomery, this young pastor was asked by his senior pastor colleagues in the city, much older men, to head, they asked him, the new kid in town, so to speak, to head the Montgomery Improvement Association and lead the boycott against the Montgomery public bus system. The boycott, that, as we all know, was triggered by the arrest of Rosa Parks when she refused to give up her seat on the bus. Called into the forefront of a movement at the age of 26. Any 26-year-olds in the room? A couple? Okay. For 381 days, he led the boycott. Dr. King led the boycott, all the while preaching against violence and for justice. Was he afraid? He should have been, given the history of lynching and other acts of racial violence in that region. It was only a year after the murder of Emmett Till. Just a few months before that, there had been the lynching of a black pastor in a neighboring state simply for trying to register to vote. But his courage, Dr. King's courage, was fueled by his faith, not surprisingly, given what we know about him. He told his wife, after prayerful consideration, "I am convinced that the psychological moment has come when a concentrated drive against injustice can bring great tangible gains." We know how this story ends. We know the success of the boycott, the soaring career of Dr. King as a national and international leader committed to nonviolent social protest, the historic March on Washington in 1963, the I Have a Dream speech, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and then, of course, the tragic assassination in April of 1968. We know the story of Martin Luther King Jr. as a courageous leader answering a deeply felt call. But do we know the story of Martin Luther King as a follower? I like to tell the story of Martin Luther King as a follower, particularly at a university where there are so many students, because the people he followed were indeed students. In 1960, Martin Luther King Jr. left Montgomery and returned to his hometown of Atlanta, where he joined his father as co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. I live in Atlanta now, that's where Spelman College is, and when I think of my daily experience at the local malls or in the hotels downtown or at the cultural events or at diverse gatherings like this one, it seems hard to remember that it was not always the case, that black people or other people of color had such access in Atlanta to restaurants and libraries and restrooms and water fountains. The world of segregation, the 1954 world of segregation into which I was born, no longer exists in that way. And we certainly celebrate these changes. I am intrigued with your theme, Civil Rights Postponed. It seems certainly appropriate for lots of reasons, and we can talk about why that's an appropriate theme today in 2007. But certainly, we do have to acknowledge that there have been changes since 1954, and those changes are in part the legacy of Dr. King, but I think Dr. King would want us to also remember the names of people like Willie Mays, and I'm not talking about the baseball player, James Felder, Marlon Bennett, Don Clark, Marianne Smith, and Rosalind Pope. So who are they? They were members of his community, college students in Atlanta. The student government presidents of Atlanta University, Clark College, Interdenominational Theological Center, Morehouse College, Morris Brown College, and Spelman College, respectively. In 1960, these students placed a full-page ad in the Atlanta Constitution, the city's newspaper, and titled their ad, "An Appeal for Human Rights." In this ad, which was quite a remarkable thing, I wish I had a copy of it with me, but it was a full-page ad, and it detailed in lots of different ways the ways in which human rights were being denied in the state of Georgia and in the city of Atlanta. They challenged the segregation in federally funded hospitals and in schools. They challenged the absence of black police and firefighters. They raised questions about inequities in school funding. They protested the fact that even in 1960, many of them were still being denied the right to vote. It was a very powerful and courageous statement, this full-page ad in the Atlanta newspaper. The ad marked the beginning of several years of highly visible student activism, sit-ins, kneel-ins, marches, and other forms of nonviolent protest. The students were really out front in terms of the civil rights movement as it was expressed in the city of Atlanta. Dr. King wrote these words about their actions. A generation of young people has come out of decades of shadows to face naked state power. It has lost its fears and experienced the majestic dignity of a direct struggle with their own history. The slave revolts, the incomplete revolution of the Civil War, the brotherhood of colonial colored men in Africa and Asia. They are an integral part of the history which is reshaping the world, replacing a dying order with a modern democracy. These young people were threatened with physical violence, jailed repeatedly, and yet they persisted. They felt the courage of their calling to be change agents. And in Atlanta, it was the students who led, as I've said, and Dr. King who often followed. Parker Palmer is a contemporary writer. I'm sure some of you have heard that name, one that I admire a great deal, and he wrote a book called Let Your Life Speak. In this book, he talks about leadership, and he says this: leadership is a concept we often resist. It seems immodest, even self-aggrandizing, to think of ourselves as leaders. But if it's true that we are made for community, then leadership is everyone's vocation, and it can be an evasion to insist that it is not. When we live in the close-knit ecosystem called community, everyone follows and everyone leads. Even I, he writes, have come to understand that for better or for worse, I lead by word and deed, simply because I am here doing what I do. If you are also here doing what you do, then you also exercise leadership of some sort. Dr. King was part of a community, as we all are, and in that community he was both a leader and a follower. And I think particularly as we approach the holiday, Martin Luther King's birthday, celebrating that holiday, sometimes as we rightly remember the inspiring words and the incredible deeds of an extraordinary genius as Dr. King was, in the process we wrongly forget the extraordinary courage of ordinary people, young and old, who changed the society forever for the better. We need to remember that it was not just superheroes like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that brought about these changes. It was extraordinary, ordinary people, extraordinary, ordinary young people who made these changes happen. And 53 years after Brown versus Board of Education, 40-plus years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we still have work to do. In fact, some of that work is being undone as we speak. Certainly, as we think about Brown versus Board of Education, we know that today public schools across the nation are more segregated than they were 30 years ago. That the peak of school desegregation happened in the 70s, and it's been pretty much backward movement since then. It is ironic that it is the Department of Education that has sided with the plaintiffs in the Supreme Court case against those communities that have voluntarily integrated their schools, forcing, assuming the Supreme Court rules in the favor of the plaintiffs, forcing those schools to abandon successful school desegregation programs. Needless to say, there is a lot of work to do. And we can't wait for another superhero, another Dr. King. We need the courage of ordinary people to continue the quest for the beloved community that Dr. King envisioned, a community that includes everyone, that is inclusive, but he wasn't only talking about inclusion and tolerance to make people feel better. He was also talking about access to opportunity, access to the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those students in 1960 challenged the segregation in federally funded hospitals. We, and I'm sure Angela Davis talked about the work we have to do, but we have to challenge the continuing reality of health disparities and access to health insurance and quality health care. Those students in 1960 challenged legalized segregation in schools. We still have to challenge inequities in school funding and access to educational opportunity, particularly if we want to remain globally competitive and to educate all of our nation. Those students challenged the absence of black police and firefighters. We still have to raise questions about racial disparities in sentencing and other injustices in our criminal justice system. Those students in 1960 demanded the right to vote. We know from recent experience in our country that the right to vote still has not been guaranteed. In my own state of Georgia, it is increasingly difficult to get voter identification cards, which are now being required, to be able to vote at the polls. Dr. King spoke about poverty and peace. We still live in a time of want and war. It is true that in the last 50 years, the world has changed. But clearly, it is also true that the world still needs changing. We live in a tremendous time of uncertainty globally, a time of international conflict, and a time for needed peace, a time of economic instability, and a time of needed innovation, a time of a growing divide between the haves and the have-nots, and a time of needed social reform, a time of disease and a time for needed cures, a time of shrinking environmental resources, and a time to preserve the earth. The world needs changing, and it will not change without all of our efforts. So my question to all of you is, what have you been called to do? What courage do you need? What community do we all have to help us be leaders and followers? If we cannot wait for the next superhero to inspire us to write the letter to the editor, to ask the uncomfortable question at the meeting, to engage our neighbors, friends, and coworkers in dialogue about race relations and other important issues, then the question is, who will motivate us? How will we motivate ourselves? Do we hear a phone ringing? And are we ready to answer it? Each of us has a sphere of influence. I do always talk about that sphere of influence. And we have to ask, how am I using it? Who do you influence and how? Everybody influences somebody, whether it is your parents, your friends, your coworkers, your teammates, your roommates, your congregation members, your board members, your the people you stand in line with at the grocery store. Everyone has an opportunity to influence other people. And the question is, how do we use that opportunity to educate, to inspire, to raise questions about what we see going on around us? I had an experience, I guess it was in 1997, shortly after my book, Why Are All the Black Kids, came out in the hardcover version. And I was invited to participate in a celebration of I think it was the 40th anniversary of the school desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And if you know anything about the challenges around the school desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, you know that they had to bring in the National Guard to escort the students, the Little Rock Nine. It was a very emotional time. And I'm sure a dangerous time. And when I was there, back at Central High School in Little Rock, I had the experience of seeing the high school. If you've never been there, it looks like a fortress. You know, it's a large brick building, and to enter the school, you have to walk down into a pit and then up some stairs into the school, kind of like crossing a moat, almost, if you can imagine that. And so you walk down from these steps, and then you have to walk up, and you could imagine that the people who could stand on the sides of that sort of looking down at you, kind of like, being a gladiator going into the pit. And so people could lean over and yell at you, and that was what was going on, of course. And at this 40th anniversary, there were people who had been students there at that time, who had been in high school. And one of the speakers was the senior class president. That was his role back in 1957. He was the senior class president. And he was a now middle-aged man. And he talked about the fact that when he was the senior class president, he spoke against the desegregation. He was opposed to this, the desegregation. And, now as this middle-aged man, he was able to say, I was wrong. But this is what, I thought at the time, this is what I said at the time. And that in itself was an interesting dialogue. But across the street from Central High School is a gas station. And it's a Mobil Gas Station. And if you are old enough to remember, the Mobil Gas Station used to have this winged Pegasus as its symbol. Now it's ExxonMobil, and I don't know what the symbol is. But they had this winged Pegasus, and that gas station was there in 1957, and it's been turned into a museum about the desegregation of Central High School. It still looks like a gas station from the 1950s, but when you enter it, it's a museum, and they have videotape and photographs and all this memorabilia from that time. Well, this weekend that they were celebrating the 40th anniversary, this museum was just being opened for the first time. And so we had a chance to go through it. And as I was walking through, I was walking behind an older white man. He looked like he was, in his 60s, maybe older. But he was walking with a woman who I assumed was his wife. And they were walking through, looking at all the pictures and stuff. And then there was, at the very end of the exhibit, there was a video presentation where some of the Little Rock Nine and other people were talking about what it was like for them when they were in the high school. And this man started to cry. I was, behind him as moving through the museum, and he started to just weep. And I tried to imagine why he was crying, what memories it was evoking for him. And I tried to imagine what he was doing in 1957. And I don't know, he could have very well been one of the National Guardsmen trying to protect the students. But it led me to think of this question. 50 years from now, what will people say about what we were doing? When we look back 50 years from now, and I plan to still be here, but some of us will still be here. If I'm not, some of you will be here. And when you look back 50 years from now, thinking about the social issues that are relevant and important today, what will people say? What will you say yourself that you were doing? What phones were ringing, and did you answer them or did you not? And if you answered them, what did you say when you picked up the phone? That is the question I think we all have to ask ourselves. How will the world be different in the next 50 years because of our actions today? Those who came before us risked their own discomfort to make a difference. Each of us must ask, how have I stepped beyond my comfort zone to leave the world a better place for the next generation? As Gandhi said, one of Dr. King's sources of inspiration, we must be the change we want to see in the world. The phone is ringing. It is our turn to answer it. On March 31st, 1968, Dr. King gave his last Sunday morning speech before his assassination. He gave that speech at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. This is what he said to his audience, and I would like to conclude on this weekend, on the eve of Martin Luther King's birthday, I would like to conclude with this charge, his charge. He said to his audience, "Let me close by saying that we have difficult days ahead in the struggle for justice and peace. But I will not yield to a politic of despair. I'm going to maintain hope. This time we will really confront a Goliath. God grant that we will be that David of truth set out against the Goliath of injustice, the Goliath of neglect, the Goliath of refusing to deal with the problems, and go on with the determination to make America the truly great America that it is called to be. God grant that we will be participants in this newness and this magnificent development. If we will but do it, we will bring about a new day of justice and brotherhood and peace. And that day the morning stars will sing together, and the sons and daughters of God will shout for joy. God bless you. Thank you very much for coming. I have been advised that we have a little time, about 5 or 10 minutes, and so there is an opportunity to ask a question or two, or to, yes?
In light of the recent developments in Michigan, where you have some ties there, Utah's on the short list of 9 states identified for a similar strategy by Ward Connolly. I'm curious what you think some solutions would be to things that are going on right now.
Well, I think it is very discouraging, but as I said in my speech, I will paraphrase Dr. King, we cannot give in to the politics of despair. But it is certainly, I will begin, let me talk about Michigan for a minute. I am a graduate of the University of Michigan, and I was very proud of the position that the University of Michigan took to defend its affirmative action policies, recognizing the importance of diversity in higher education. I do, however, see us at a very dangerous, I think, for our society, a very difficult and dangerous time. And, in fact, I say that because I really think that there are those who, in their own misguided way, are rolling the clock backwards. The Michigan case was very important, clearly in higher education, the Supreme Court case. Now, of course, I'm going to talk about the vote in a minute. But the Michigan Supreme Court case was a very important case because, the assault on affirmative action in higher education was well underway, and many schools and universities, colleges and universities around the country were backing away from progressive policies for fear that they would be sued. And it was one of the things that, this is one of the reasons why I was certainly proud of the University of Michigan that they did not back down. They spent, I'm sure, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars defending their position, but they did so. It was a very courageous thing for them to do. And it was important. But the process that we saw in higher education, we are now seeing in public education. And so we don't have time, but I will say this. I'll just take a moment to plug the fact that I have a new book coming out. And my new book is entitled, Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation? And if you look at the judicial history of school desegregation as it relates to public education, we have seen one decision after another. I mean, it's an ironic thing that in 2004 there was a lot of fanfare about the fact that it was the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. But Brown versus Board of Education has all but been reversed by a series of Supreme Court decisions over time, really beginning with President Nixon's tenure. When President Nixon had the opportunity to appoint Supreme Court justices, one of the things that he chose to do was to choose justices who he felt would oppose school busing. In fact, he had these tapes in his office, and one of the things that he was recorded on tape saying was that he didn't care, about whether they were conservative or not, as long as they were opposed to school busing. In terms of his selections of Supreme Court justices, and he ultimately had the opportunity to appoint 4. And one of the first cases that came up after the appointment of those 4 justices was a Michigan case known as the Milliken case. And this was a case in the late, I want to say mid-70s, that involved school busing. And, if you have a history of residential segregation, so this is a Michigan case, another Michigan case, an earlier Michigan case, if you have a history of residential segregation, it's going to be difficult to desegregate the schools without crossing district lines. And there are, of course, Detroit is the major city, but there are a ring of suburbs around Detroit that had racial covenants in there, that prevented black families from moving in, buying property, moving into those communities. So surprise, surprise, they're white communities, right? So so if you have a largely black school district, as you had in Detroit, and you want to desegregate those schools, the only way to do it is to involve the suburban communities. And the Milliken case basically had to do with the fact that schools were, the suburban school districts said, why should the children of our districts have to be involved in the desegregation of that city's schools? And the Supreme Court ruled that they don't. And so they basically said you can't have busing across district lines. So Detroit, you can desegregate your schools if you want to, but you can't involve those other school districts. Which in essence said you can't desegregate urban communities because you don't have enough white students to do so. Or it also said to the white population, if I move out of the city, I don't have to participate. So you got a lot of white flight, and that was the beginning of the process of resegregation. This is a long response to your question, but to just rewind before Nixon, the president before Nixon was President Johnson, right? Lyndon Baines Johnson. And during Lyndon Johnson's tenure, one of the things that he did was to say, if you don't desegregate, you're not going to be able to access Department of Education funds, right? So during President Johnson's tenure, there was dramatic and rapid desegregation of Southern schools. And something like, 98% of black students attended segregated schools in the South before President Johnson's tenure. And within a 4-year period, that number had dropped to about 25%. So it was quite dramatic. So this is to say, school busing, as controversial as it had been effective in some communities. But the Milliken decision really was sort of opened the door to unravel that progress. A subsequent decision was the Oklahoma decision, and I'm just, fast forwarding now. The Oklahoma decision was in 1991, and the Oklahoma decision had to do with this. If you have had a history of school segregation, and if you have been court ordered by, your district court to desegregate, and you have a busing program and you do other things, how long do you have to keep reporting to that judge before you can say, we've solved our problem, leave us alone? And so the Oklahoma case had to do with that question. How long does the court have jurisdiction? If you can prove that you have solved your problem, you no longer discriminate, you're not segregating anymore, and now you have a plan in place to maintain that, do you have to continue to be under court supervision? Oklahoma, and I'm greatly condensing this, but Oklahoma basically, the Oklahoma Supreme Court decision said, after you've demonstrated that you've gone from a 2-district system, as in a colored and a white or black-white system, if you no longer have a black-white system, you've just got one school district and there's no evidence that you're segregating, then you don't have to be under court supervision anymore. Well, what that has meant is that districts all over the country that have demonstrated that at least for a little while they stopped segregating have been released from court supervision, and perhaps not surprisingly, they are now going back to their old pattern of neighborhood schools. Well, neighborhood schools are not by law discriminating, but if you have a pattern of residential segregation in your community that has been unbroken, neighborhood schools means you are returning to segregated schools. So all over the country, there have been schools returning. So now we have a situation where there have been some school districts, Seattle is one of them, Seattle is the case, one of the school districts involved in the current Supreme Court case, that have said, because of the housing patterns in our community, our schools are not legally segregated, but, de facto segregation, and we want to do something about that. So we're going to have magnet schools. We're going to put special programs in these neighborhoods to encourage cross-town travel, and that will encourage our schools to be multiracial and will encourage the kind of diversity we think is important for young people to experience in the 21st century. And however, if you want to maintain that kind of diversity, you have to do what the University of Michigan was doing, which is count. You have to not necessarily establish quotas, But how will you know you're achieving your goals? It's like trying to lose weight. How do you know if you are, how will you know you're achieving your goal if you don't periodically weigh yourself? You know what I mean? You have to monitor your progress. And so in the process of monitoring, these schools were keeping track of how many. And what has happened is that some white families have sued the schools because they've said, we live in the neighborhood, we want to go to this school. And the schools have said, well, because we've got this plan in terms of trying to diversify, if we let all the neighborhood kids come, there won't be room for the other kids and we won't have diversity. And so that's the case, that's the essence of the case that is happening now. And the prediction is, we will all see, but the prediction is that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the neighborhood school parents who say, we ought to be able to go and you shouldn't be paying attention to race. The title, one of the reasons that my new book is called Can We Talk About Race? That title has many meanings, but one of the meanings is, can we talk about race? Like, are we even allowed to talk about it? Are we even allowed to count? Can we? Is it legal to do so? And that's really one of the questions that's before the Supreme Court now. But however that case turns out, it's the same if you watch the process for those cases in public education. We're going to see a similar parallel. The ways in which diversity is being sort of negated as an important value in higher education, it's being similarly devalued in public school education. And so what does this mean for us as a society? It means, because we still do have a lot of residential segregation across the country, most white students grow up in white neighborhoods. Most black students grow up in black neighborhoods or largely black neighborhoods. Most Latino students grow up in largely Latino neighborhoods. Asian Americans are the most likely to live in racially mixed communities, followed by Native Americans. And that may seem odd because, of course, we know that many Native peoples live on reservations, but those who do not are living in very mixed communities. And but if we have an increasingly diverse population, but if we have students, young people, K through 12, who are having increasingly limited opportunity to go to school with people different from themselves, then they get to college and are clueless. And that creates all kinds of social as well as academic issues, hostile classrooms. We can all think of, and I don't know what the history has been here at the University of Utah, but we can all think about highly publicized things that have happened on college campuses that have created difficult learning environments for students of color. And those things are more likely to happen more frequently because young people will not have firsthand experience. What they will know about people of color and each other across lines of difference will be largely secondhand. And if you watch much television, you know that there's still a lot of stereotypes circulating in our environment that become the framework with which people view the world. Now, to get to your question specifically about what is wrong or what's the risk. I mean, you can see this progress through these states, California, Texas, Michigan. I think that those of us who are concerned about this need to do a much better job in telling why it's a problem. I think that many people, if you say to someone, do you think we should pay attention to race when we're admitting students? There are a lot of people who, or if you say, do you think we should live in a colorblind society? There are a lot of people who will say, yeah, I think that sounds good, live in a colorblind society. But you need to have the context of, well, if we don't pay attention to race and if we don't do anything about, changing the way our neighborhoods are structured, your child is going to grow up in an environment where he or she does not learn to deal with people different from themselves. Is that what you had in mind? I think you have to talk about the implications of the question. Maybe some people will answer the question and say, yes, that is what I had in mind. In which case, you need to say, well, do you understand how that's going to disadvantage them in the workplace? Do you understand that there are companies that won't hire people like that? Do you understand that there are people who, blow their careers because they can't engage across lines of difference very effectively? And there are a lot of people in a global environment who are learning how to do that, and your child is going to be at a significant disadvantage. I think we have to really help people understand the implications of these votes. And I don't think, unfortunately, in Michigan and perhaps in other places, the case has been made well enough. But I think it is an unfortunate thing if it continues. We will all have to ask the question 50 years from now, what did we do to make it better? Yes.
Will you share with us your views on the immigration crisis that our nation faces today?
Well, certainly we have an immigration issue. I'm not sure it's a crisis. What I mean by that is that certainly there's a lot of dialogue about immigration. Immigration, our country is a land of immigrants. Not all of us immigrated in the way that we think about it today. But, and certainly there are indigenous peoples here. And some of those who we describe as immigrants are indeed indigenous to this, this continent, this part of the world. However, so I guess my question is, I think that we need to look at the ways in which we are developing policy that is fair and equitable and not based on greed. I guess that's what I would say. I'm going to end at this point because it's 5 after 4 and my ride has just walked in, waving. As you may know, that I am here in Salt Lake City because I was invited to give a speech earlier today, and happy to be here as well. But I am traveling with 40 young women from Spelman College who are singing. The Spelman College Glee Club is in Salt Lake City and performing this evening at Westminster College at 7:30. And if you haven't heard about this, you would be well informed to show up because they are fabulous. But I have other things that I now need to do. But I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer your question more fully, but there's much to say about it. There certainly is much to say about it. I thank you for your time and attention, and hope that you will answer the phone when you hear it ringing. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, I've been asked, just to inform you, it's at Vive Gore Hall. The event is free. If you do miss that, Calvary Baptist Church this Sunday will be hosting an interfaith service with the Spelman Glee Club. We invite you to come and join with us there. That event is also free.